There's a video that I will never forget watching for the first time. It was February 2010. I was still in middle school. And I can remember sitting with my friends, hunched over a laptop screen, laughing. The video came from a broadcast of Aló Presidente. Hugo Chávez's TV show.
Buenas noches, amigas y amigos. Buenas noches, compatriotas.
Where he regularly spoke to the country for hours, pontificating, singing, governing, and campaigning, all at once. On this particular morning, Chávez was walking through Plaza Bolívar in the historic center of Caracas alongside Jorge Rodríguez, the mayor of central Caracas.
Bueno, estamos en el corazón de Caracas. Caracas, la rebelde. ¿Cómo estás tú?
As they walked, Chávez began pointing at the buildings surrounding the plaza and asked Rodríguez what they were.
Ese edificio ahí, ¿qué es? Ese es un teatro antiguo, ¿no era?
Then Chávez pointed toward another building containing several jewelry stores.
¿Y este edificio?
Es un edificio que tiene comercio privado de joyería.
Exprópiese.
De acuerdo.
Chávez barely hesitated. Exprópiese. Expropriated. That one word became one of Chávez's most infamous catchphrases. But he wasn't finished. He continued pointing at more buildings around the plaza.
Y aquel edificio allá en la esquina, ahí lo que están en unos negocios. Exprópiese.
Exprópiese, expropiese, expropiese. Over and over again, Chávez issued the order, live on national television, as the people surrounding him applauded.
Este edificio aquí, ¿cuál es?
De propiedad privada, por tanto.
Exprópiese, señor alcalde. Exprópiese.
And I have to be honest, there's still something deeply comical about that video to me. The casualness of it, the theatricality. The way Chávez points toward a building, says one word, and everyone immediately understands that a decision has been made. But underneath the comedy was something truly horrifying. Because this wasn't Chávez improvising. By 2010, Chávez dominated the Venezuelan state. A command delivered casually during his TV show would set the entire machinery of the government into motion. And that single word, expropiese, would come to symbolize his economic model. Expropriations, nationalizations, price controls, state-owned companies, the destruction of private property in the name of Chávez's socialist project. Because Chávez believed that the state could seize, control, and command its way to prosperity. But it couldn't, and Venezuela would pay the price. You'll remember from last week's episode that it was only after Chávez won re-election in December 2006 that he officially launched his socialist project for Venezuela.
El socialismo venezolano!
Expropriation quickly became the central tool of this new socialist era Chávez envisioned. On January 8, 2007, just 2 days before he was sworn in for another term, Chávez announced that the state would take control of the telecommunications giant CanTV, as well as the country's largest private electricity company, Electricidad de Caracas. Now, state ownership of utilities is not by itself particularly unusual, but these nationalizations were only the beginning. Over the next several years, the Venezuelan state moved into sector after sector of the economy. The stated goal was to place what Chávez called the country's strategic resources under public ownership. And almost anything could be declared strategic.
El martes firmo el decreto de expropiación y tomo el control de inmediato de la empresa.
On Tuesday, I signed the expropriation decree and the immediate seizure of the company. Cement manufacturers were brought under state control. So was Sidor, Venezuela's largest steel producer. The government then moved into banking, construction, and agriculture. In agriculture, Chávez ordered the takeover of Agroisleña, Venezuela's largest supplier of seeds, fertilizers, technical assistance, and credit to farmers.
Agroisleña está expropiada.
Agroisleña is now expropriated.
Se acabó el tiempo de la agroisleña esta.
Agroisleña's time is up. The company was renamed Agropatria and placed under state management. The government also took control of supermarket chains, including one called Éxito.
Yo ordeno que se abra un expediente para iniciar un proceso expropiatorio de la cadena Éxito.
I order the opening of proceedings to begin the expropriation of the Éxito chain, combining them into a new state-owned chain called Abastos Bicentenario. and these were only the most famous cases. Between 2005 and 2010, more than 1,150 companies were nationalized. The sectors most heavily targeted were construction, agriculture, oil, commerce, and food, the basic industries on which the rest of the economy depended. And by the end of the decade, expropriation had become one of the defining features of Chávez's economic policy. Now, the process was not identical in every case. Some major companies negotiated payments for their shares. Others were compensated only after years of disputes. But smaller Venezuelan businesses had far less power, never receiving compensation. But the fundamental problem went beyond the disputes over compensation. Under Chávez, private property was no longer protected. Once the president announced that a company would be taken over, government officials would immediately occupy its facilities. And only afterward were the owners left to argue over what, if anything, they would receive in return. And the assault on private property didn't stop with large companies. A series of laws governing unused land and vacant housing gave legal and political cover to property occupations. Across Venezuela, Chávez supporters invaded farms, homes, apartment buildings, and businesses, claiming the right to remain because the property was supposedly abandoned or unproductive. These weren't simply isolated acts of lawlessness. They took place under the protection and often with the direct encouragement of the state. Chávez himself celebrated the occupations as acts of revolutionary justice.
Por eso al pueblo, el que vea por ahí un pedacito de tierra que esté abandonada, que esté ociosa, vámonos.
To the people, whoever sees a piece of land that's abandoned, that's idle, let's go.
El pueblo lo denuncia, los soldados la toman, la milicia la toma con el pueblo.
The people denounce it, the soldiers take it, the militia takes it, with the people. For ordinary Venezuelans, the fear was no longer only that the government might seize what they owned. It was that anyone acting in the name of the revolution might seize it for themselves. In Chávez's Venezuela, nothing you owned was truly beyond the reach of the revolution. But expropriation was not just economic policy, it was revolutionary theater. Chávez announced new takeovers during his Aló Presidente broadcasts or in public rallies, reading out the names of companies to be seized as if he were reading off a grocery list.
Exprópiese. Planta Guarena, exprópiese. Planta Lara, exprópiese. Planta de Electrosoldado Valencia, exprópiese.
It was pure political showmanship backed by the coercive power of the state. Expropriation also became a weapon of intimidation, a threat that Chávez could direct at any company he accused of defying the revolution. In January 2011, during a national broadcast, Chávez picked up his cell phone and called Pedro Rodríguez, the president of BBVA Banco Provincial, one of Venezuela's largest private banks. Chávez accused the bank of refusing to comply with government rules governing mortgages and housing.
Señor presidente del Banco Provincial.
Mr. President of Banco Provincial.
Es el presidente Chávez, como ya usted sabe.
Is President Chávez, as you already know. Then, on live national television, Chávez declared an ultimatum.
Si el Banco Provincial que usted preside aquí en Venezuela no está dispuesto a cumplir con las leyes, los decretos presidenciales, comience usted a entregarme el banco.
If the bank you preside over is not willing to comply with the laws and presidential decrees, start handing the bank over to me.
Yo le voy a pagar lo que cuesta el banco.
I'll pay you what it's worth. There was a pause. We can't hear Rodriguez's response, but he apparently asked Chávez to allow his voice to be heard on the national broadcast. Chávez refused.
Él me está pidiendo que su voz salga en cadena. No.
He's asking to put his voice on the cadena. No. Then Chávez repeated the threat.
Esto es muy serio. O usted cumple con las leyes o entrégueme el banco.
This is very serious. Either you comply with the laws or you hand over the bank.
Dígame cuánto vale el banco. ¿Oyó? No voy a discutir con usted. No voy a discutir con usted.
Tell me how much it costs. I'm not going to debate with you. That final sentence captured the entire relationship between Chávez and the private sector. I'm not going to debate with you. There would be no negotiation, no independent institution, no court who would decide whether the government's actions were legal or justified. Chávez would decide whether a company had complied, and Chávez would decide whether its owners were allowed to keep it. This was part of a much broader pattern. As shortages and inflation worsened, Chávez increasingly described Venezuela's economic problems as an economic war being waged by a counter-revolutionary businessman elite.
Como ustedes saben, la burguesía nos ha declarado la guerra económica.
Companies accused of raising prices, withholding products, or violating government controls were no longer merely breaking economic regulations. They were sabotaging the revolution. When supermarkets increased prices following the devaluation of the bolívar, Chávez dismissed temporary closures as insufficient punishment.
¿De qué nos sirve que cierren un supermercado por un día? Se burlan.
What good does it do to close a supermarket for a day? They're laughing at us.
No.
No.
Yo propongo expropiación de esos negocios.
I propose expropriation of those businesses.
Expropiación.
Expropriation.
Y nosotros podemos pasárselo a los trabajadores que ahí laboran.
And we can hand them over to the workers who work there.
Que estoy seguro que ellos no van a robar a nadie.
I'm sure they won't rob anyone. The government applied the same logic to the food industry. State officials occupied rice mills, coffee processors, agricultural suppliers, and other companies accused of hoarding products or evading price controls. This logic had already been visible years earlier. In 2009, Chávez ordered the expropriation of a rice processing plant owned by Cargill, the multinational corporation.
Firmé la decisión para expropiar un conjunto de plantas procesadoras de arroz de una transnacional que no quiere cumplir con las regulaciones nacionales. Entonces, bueno, venga acá, ven a mí que tengo flores.
I've signed the decision to expropriate several rice processing plants from the transnational company that doesn't want to comply with national regulations. The Minister of Commerce then explained the ideological reasoning.
Mire, una planta de arroz es más estratégica que una refinería o que una central eléctrica.
A rice processing plant is more strategic than a refinery or an electrical grid.
¿Por qué? Porque el arroz es esencial en la dieta.
Why? Because rice is essential to a person's diet.
Ese tipo de industria debe estar bajo el control social.
Therefore, this type of industry must be under social control. Under that logic, almost any company could be declared strategic, and any economic disagreement became justification for state control. If prices increased, the owners were thieves. If production declined, they were hoarding. If they objected to government controls, they were sabotaging the economy. And if they resisted Chávez, he could threaten to take everything from them, live on television. But what was the ideological justification for all of this? According to Chávez, expropriation was not simply about transferring companies from private owners to the government. It was supposed to create an entirely new economic system. Multinational corporations and wealthy business owners would be replaced by public ownership, cooperatives, and what the government called worker co-management. Factories would no longer exist to enrich a small group of private owners. They would be managed collectively, producing for the good of society, rather than for profit. At least that was the theory. But here's the thing. In reality, the workers didn't actually become the owners. The company just became property of the Venezuelan state. Government ministries retained control over appointments, financing, and production. Political officials and state-appointed managers made the decisions that private owners had once made. So what emerged was not genuine worker control. It was more like state capitalism. It was a bureaucratic state ownership, administered from above, exclusively by Chavista loyalists. Without competition, independent oversight, or any real risk of failure, these companies became fertile ground for corruption. Many survived only because the government continued to pump oil money into them. Most suffered chronic losses or complete collapse. Chávez also tightened state control over private employment. In 2012, he rewrote Venezuela's labor laws by decree, expanding benefits and job protections while exposing employers who defied certain reinstatement orders to possible arrest. Once again, the policy was presented as power for workers, but the real power belonged to the state, which now decided whether a company could dismiss an employee and could punish its managers for resisting with jail time. In theory, this new economic model would break the power of oligopolies and multinational corporations and return economic life to the people. But in practice, it made producing anything in Venezuela extremely difficult and risky. Why would you invest in a factory if the government could seize it whenever it wanted? Why hire more workers if you might never be allowed to fire them? Why increase production if the government could accuse you of hoarding the moment that goods disappeared from the shelves? But the damage had begun long before Chávez completed this legal transformation. His government had created an impossible trap. Companies were ordered to sell products at prices that increasingly failed to cover the cost of producing them. Some manufacturers reduced production. Others stopped producing regulated goods altogether. Products disappeared from stores and reappeared on black markets at much higher prices, especially basic goods like eggs, milk, coffee, corn flour, sugar, and cooking oil. The government responded to each new failure in one of two ways. It could seize more of the economy and attempt to produce those goods itself, or it could use Venezuela's oil money to import them from somewhere else. For a while, the oil money made that model seem sustainable. But underneath, Venezuela was gradually losing the ability to produce what its population consumed. By the end of 2007, annual inflation had reached 22.5%. Shortages of milk, sugar, coffee, meat, and other basic products had become increasingly common. This was an extraordinary contradiction, because Venezuela was experiencing the largest oil boom in its history. Billions of dollars were pouring into the country. The economy was growing rapidly, and yet Venezuelans were struggling to find milk. The government blamed the shortages on private sector mafias, business owners supposedly hoarding products, sabotaging production, and waging an economic war against the revolution. But the oil boom concealed the deeper problem. Instead of creating the conditions for Venezuelan companies and farms to produce more, the government increasingly used oil revenue to import whatever the country no longer produced for itself. Imports filled supermarket shelves, subsidies kept prices artificially low, but the entire structure depended on one thing: oil money continuing to flow. The first serious warning came in late 2008, when the global financial crisis sent oil prices tumbling. Venezuela entered a recession. Inflation remained above 25%. And the weaknesses of Chávez's socialist economic model became much harder to ignore. This was not yet the final collapse, though. Oil prices would eventually recover, and Chávez would once again use government spending to revive the economy. But the crisis had revealed what was hiding beneath the oil boom. Venezuela's prosperity was increasingly disconnected from its capacity to produce. And when confronted with that warning, Chávez didn't reconsider the model. He doubled down. But Chávez's economic model didn't only undermine production, it also created extraordinary opportunities for corruption. Every new control gave a government official power over something valuable: the power to award a state contract or approve an import license, the power to decide which company received government subsidies, and more importantly, the power to decide who could purchase dollars at the government's artificially cheap exchange rate. Under the new currency control agency known as CADIVI, businesses needed government authorization to obtain the dollars necessary to import goods into Venezuela. For anyone connected to the government, the opportunity was enormous. A company could obtain cheap dollars by claiming it needed to import food, machinery, or medicine. It could inflate the value of what it was importing. It could import only a fraction of what it promised to import. Sometimes the company didn't even need to import anything at all. The difference between the official exchange rate and the real value of the dollar created almost unlimited opportunities for fraud. And access depended on political connections. Ironically, Chávez had promised to destroy Venezuela's old elite, and instead, his revolution just created a new one. Government officials, military officers, contractors, and well-connected businessmen accumulated fortunes through state contracts, subsidies, and preferential dollars. Venezuela gave this new class a name: la boliburguesía, the Bolivarian bourgeoisie. And the physical evidence of the system would eventually be seen across the country. State-owned factories operating at a fraction of their capacity, and then collapsing. Housing developments and infrastructure projects left unfinished. Railway tracks ending in empty fields. Construction sites that looked more like graveyards, abandoned after billions had been spent on projects that were never completed. Chávez's revolution had promised to place Venezuela's oil wealth in the hands of the people. And instead, an enormous share of that wealth disappeared into inflated contracts, fraudulent imports, and unfinished projects, directly into the bank accounts of a new revolutionary elite. The revolution had not abolished the oligarchy. It simply created its own. And here's what I want you to take away from this. People often talk about Venezuela's economic collapse as something separate from Hugo Chávez. This is partly because oil prices fell shortly after his death in 2013. But the truth is that the economic disaster and the humanitarian catastrophe that followed under Nicolás Maduro can be traced directly to Chávez. And these policies, this spree of mass expropriations, were the central component of Chávez's socialist project. Chávez believed that the state could become the driving engine of the transformation of society, that by taking control of the country's most essential sectors, the government could lower prices, increase production, and redistribute economic power. But that's obviously not what happened, and the reasons were even more obvious. Chávez's government was built entirely around loyalty. As long as you remained loyal to Chávez and to the revolution, you were free to steal, embezzle, and enrich yourself through the state. And because Chávez controlled every institution, especially the courts, there was no independent authority capable of holding these people accountable. So when the state took over companies, it ran them into the ground. Why? Because corruption destroys any possibility of running an effective business. Political loyalty replaced competence. Government ministries replaced experienced managers. And state companies became vehicles for theft and revolutionary propaganda. The result was a decimated economy in which only those connected to Chávez could do business. Soon, products began to disappear, not because of hoarding, not because of sabotage, and not because of some imaginary economic war. They disappeared because the companies that had once produced them went bankrupt, collapsed, and stopped functioning after they were taken over by the state. And I cannot stress how catastrophic this was. Take Agroisleña. Before it was expropriated, Agroisleña was Venezuela's largest supplier of seeds and fertilizers to farmers. But it did much more than sell agricultural inputs. It provided credit, it financed machinery, it offered technical assistance to improve crop yields. It helped farmers produce more. Agroisleña was an agricultural giant in its own right. It alone supplied around 45% of the seeds, fertilizers, chemicals, and other inputs needed by Venezuelan agriculture. A few years after it was expropriated, it supplied nothing. Zero. Imagine that. One company supplied almost half of what Venezuelan agriculture needed to function. Then Chávez took it over, and it disappeared. That was the source of the shortages. Company after company, the Chávez government took over the country's most important businesses and ran them directly into the ground. Then, when Venezuelan production collapsed, the government used oil money to import the products that the country could no longer produce for itself. And it's worth thinking about how absurd all of this was. If the state truly wanted to enter the economy, why didn't it create something? Why didn't it acquire land, hire workers, build infrastructure, purchase machinery, and prove that its socialist model could produce more efficiently than the private sector? Because it was never really about production. It was about performance. It was a show. The seizure, the applause, the circus of the revolution. And when I think back to my 16-year-old self, sitting with my friends and laughing at Chávez expropriating buildings in the center of Caracas, I can't help but realize that, in one way or another, we were all under the same spell. Whether you loved Chávez or you hated him, he had captured the entire country's attention. We watched, we laughed, we argued. And while all of us were watching the show, Chávez was destroying the economy beneath our feet.